Jesus working on the Sabbath? Nah. Welcome back. Today we find ourselves in Luke chapter 6. This is the 7th episode in our Gospel of Luke series. If you haven't seen any of the previous episodes, I'll leave a link in the description to help give you some context. While there, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not only will it help you stay up to date as new episodes are released, it serves as a tremendous support for us as well. Beginning in Luke chapter 6, Jesus has begun to call some of his disciples, utilizing a miracle at the Sea of Galilee to illustrate for them that they would soon become fishers of men. He also called Levi, otherwise known as Matthew, a tax collector, who would eventually go on to pen the gospel account bearing his name. This calling led to Levi hosting a party for Jesus, in which many other tax collectors attended. All of this drew the ire of the Jewish leadership as Jesus begins and continues to challenge the status quo. Verse 1. Now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. The text explicitly mentions that the point that would serve to drive much of the initial frustration from the Jewish leadership, contention around the observance of the Sabbath. To take a step back just for a moment, in order to understand the contention around the Sabbath, it's also important to understand the mentality of the Jewish leadership of that day. We've covered this in previous studies. However, the Pharisees were a large portion of the Jewish teachers and leaders. They prided themselves on maintaining the law in its most literal sense to the nth degree. One of their primary responsibilities was to enforce Jewish law and ensure that the scriptural law was being upheld. Unfortunately, in an attempt to do so, they also expanded the written law into numerous oral traditions, of which they regarded to be at the same level of authority as the written law. Among these oral traditions, the observance of the Sabbath, which had been expanded into some 39 categories, which had to be observed. Specifically, however, the intricacies of doing so proved to be one of the most contentious issues Jesus encountered. For example, Jesus' healing the man at the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5 occurred on the Sabbath, and it led to the grumbling of the Jewish leadership as Jesus not only healed the man, but also ordered him to pick up his pallet and walk. In this particular instance in Luke, however, the objection was that plucking the grain and eating it was viewed from the perspective of the Pharisees as a form of reaping a harvest and preparing food, both of which they held to be forbidden on the Sabbath. Jesus, however, challenges their objections by citing an example in the Old Testament history regarding David. Verse 3. And Jesus answering them, said, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat, except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions? And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." With Jesus' reference to 1 Samuel 21, Jonathan, the son of King Saul, has just revealed to David that Saul intended to kill him. As a result, David is fleeing the area and comes to the tabernacle for help. Let's take a look. 1 Samuel chapter 21. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found." The priest answered David and said, "There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest and said to him, "Surely women have been kept from us, as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more then today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Jesus' point to the Pharisees was that for David and his men to eat the consecrated bread, it would have been far more serious than the rolling and eating of a few grains of wheat. However, in David's need, this was deemed to be acceptable. How much more then should the disciples' actions be accepted as well? In a parallel passage in Matthew's gospel account, Jesus also gives another example, stating that the priests break the Sabbath as well. The ritual sacrifices that were conducted by the priests were extremely labor intensive, including the lighting of fires, the slaughtering and preparation of various animals, mounting them to the altar, among a host of other labors. And yet, as Jesus points out in that passage, though the priests do break the Sabbath in practice, they remain innocent. The priestly duties, while they were laborious and so were breaking the law of the Sabbath, they were done with a heart and goal of pleasing God and obeying his commands regarding sacrifice. Jesus then proceeds to press even further, making a tremendous claim to the Jewish leaders, where he states, "The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." The Pharisaical traditions had twisted and changed the Sabbath from a day of rest to a tremendous burden. Jesus, in this statement and claim, he declares himself not only to be the Son of Man, but also to have authority over even the Sabbath. Furthermore, he points to himself as the fulfillment or the ultimate Sabbath, if you will. The picture given in the Old Testament observance of the Sabbath is such that the Israelites were allowed to work for 6 days, but rest on the seventh day. This is outlined for them in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We also see it given to them yet again in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Just as the Israelites were able to cease their physical labor and temporarily rest because of God's provision for them, so because of Jesus, we are able to cease laboring in an effort to earn our own salvation, resting, trusting, and walking in his provision for us. This theme regarding the Sabbath continues even into the next miracle of Jesus. Verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it?" After looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. By the scribes' and Pharisees' own intention, they acknowledge Jesus' ability to heal and perform miracles, yet they dismiss it due to their preconceived ideas about him. Jesus didn't fit their mold or expectations for the Messiah. Furthermore, as we see in the text, their intentions for watching Jesus closely were not for the sake of examining a teacher and evaluating whether or not his teachings were valid, based on the scriptures. Instead, they watched him closely so that they might find reason to accuse him. Even with being aware of their true intent, Jesus proceeded anyway, preparing to heal this man, even on the Sabbath. In the text, Jesus states to the man, "Get up and come forward." He was fully intentional on combating the Pharisees' notions regarding the Sabbath, not by healing the man in private, but intentionally doing so publicly. Had he been concerned for his own well-being, he easily could have simply not helped or even avoided coming to the synagogue altogether. Instead, he sought out this one who desperately needed him, even if it meant placing himself in jeopardy. In the midst of healing the man, Jesus reiterates the same point he addressed regarding the eating of the wheat in the previous passage. The Pharisees were taking their own laws, adding them to the scriptural law, and then placing that yoke of burden on the Jews. Verse 11. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. To us, it seems outlandish that they would even consider doing good, much less doing something miraculous, to be a violation of God's law, but so they did. As the text states, this perceived violation, it filled them with rage. From their admittedly misguided perspective, Jesus was breaking Sabbath law. To make matters worse, much as he did with the man he healed, he was encouraging others to participate in it as well. Jesus' goal, however, wasn't to reform or renovate the Sabbath as if he was attempting to change God's law. Instead, he was showing that they were in fact missing the entire point of the Sabbath to begin with. Not the enforcing and observing of any and every aspect of their excessive traditions, but instead a reminder of our trust and reliance upon God to supply our needs. Verse 12. It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. The text begins stating it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray. On the surface, this could seem to be a fairly innocuous detail. Jesus often went off to be alone and to pray to the Father. In fact, it was often his initial response as the societal pressures increased throughout his ministry. However, it's especially important in this situation when we consider that he is preparing to call the 12. While Jesus had many disciples, these men would be given the role of apostle, after the Greek word apostolos, meaning sent one. They would serve important and integral roles in Jesus' earthly ministry. They would travel with him and study under him, learning and gleaning from his teachings. Some of these 12, they would go on to pen gospel accounts. Most of all of them would abandon him at the crucifixion. Some would deny him. Some would betray him to death. And many, if not all, but the betrayer would witness him after the resurrection. Furthermore, those that witnessed his resurrection would also serve as witnesses to the world for him. Last but not least, all with the exception of Judas and John would be martyred for being unwilling to recant their belief in Jesus. All of that said, much as it was for the entirety of Jesus' ministry, it was crucial for him to be fully submitted to the will of the Father. As the text states, this choosing included Judas Iscariot, who would betray Jesus into the hands of the Romans prior to the crucifixion. Jesus was undoubtedly aware of what was eventually to come, but still chose him regardless. Verse 17. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place, and there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured, and all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. As the text states, the crowd present consisted of individuals from many different regions, some of which were quite distant, even from Gentile cities such as Tyre and Sidon. Jesus' popularity and notoriety had continued to grow, attracting crowds coming to hear his teachings and experience his miracles. Fascinatingly, the first action we see recorded after Jesus called the 12 was to serve. It was important that they see and understand the nature of who he was and the nature of his mission. The goal of his ministry was not to be a great emperor ruling over kingdoms and amassing great wealth, nor a great military leader conquering nations, but to be a servant, healing and setting free from affliction, possession, and disease. His mission was to serve by laying his life down to set mankind free from the powers of sin and death. Next time, we'll continue in Luke chapter 6 as Jesus begins to deliver some of his most famous teachings, the Beatitudes. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay up to date as we continue studying together. Thanks for watching.